There are moments when a man must choose between the light above and the darkness below. Most men never face such a choice, but Silas Holloway faced it on a September morning in 1849, standing at the mouth of the salt mine in Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, with a pickaxe in his hands and a decision crystallizing in his mind like salt deposits on limestone walls. The choice was simple: continue climbing toward the surface at the end of his shift, toward the sunlight and the chains that waited there, or descend deeper into the earth, into passages the overseers didn't know existed, into a darkness so complete it could swallow a man whole. Silas chose down. The Mammoth Cave system in south-central Kentucky was the longest-known cave system in the world. Over 400 miles of mapped passages, and likely hundreds more that had never been charted. In 1849, only a fraction of this vast underground labyrinth was known to the white men who owned the land above it. But the slaves who worked in the salt mines knew more. They had to. The Franklin Salt Mining Company had purchased the cave entrance and surrounding land in 1838, drawn by the rich deposits of calcium nitrate that could be harvested from the cave soil. Saltpeter was essential for gunpowder production, which made the cave valuable, which made the slaves who worked there extremely valuable. Silas had been sold to the Franklin Company in 1842 when he was 19 years old. He came from a tobacco plantation in Virginia, where he'd worked in the fields under the open sky. The transition to underground labor was meant to be temporary. That was 7 years ago. 7 years of descending into darkness at dawn and emerging at dusk. 7 years of breathing air so thick with mineral dust that it coated the lungs. 7 years of crawling through passages so narrow a man had to exhale completely just to squeeze through. 7 years of listening to the mountain groan and shift, of wondering which day the ceiling would finally collapse. The work itself was methodical and brutal. Slaves would dig out the nitrate-rich soil from the cave floor, load it into wooden carts, and haul it to the surface where it would be processed. A good worker could extract 200 pounds of soil per day. Silas extracted 300. This productivity earned him longer hours and assignments in the deepest, most dangerous sections of the mine. The overseer, a man named Carver, had once told him he had a gift for the dark. Most slaves got scared in the deep passages, started seeing things, hearing things, but not Silas. He remained calm, even 500 feet down, where the air got thin and the silence pressed against the eardrums like physical weight. Carver meant it as recognition of valuable skill, but what he didn't understand was that Silas hadn't adapted to the darkness. He'd begun to prefer it. Above ground, Silas was property, watched and controlled, reduced to a unit of labor with a dollar value. Every moment in the light was a moment of performance, of careful subservience, of swallowing rage and presenting a mask of docile competence. But below ground, in the deepest passages where even Carver wouldn't venture, the darkness erased the boundaries between slave and free. In the absolute blackness, with only the sound of his own breathing and the distant drip of water, Silas could think thoughts that would get a man killed in the daylight. He could imagine. And over 7 years, his imagination had become very specific. The 18 mine slaves lived in a long wooden barracks near the cave entrance, a structure that was more cage than shelter, with barred windows and a single door locked from the outside each night. Silas slept on a thin pallet in the corner, positioned so he could see both the door and the window. 7 years of vigilance had made this automatic. The man on the pallet next to his was Marcus, a field hand from Georgia who'd been purchased 3 months earlier. He was still adjusting to underground labor, still fighting the psychological weight of being enclosed by millions of tons of stone. At night, Marcus would whisper about suffocating even when there was air, about the mountain closing around him like a fist. Silas would tell him he'd get used to it, though this wasn't entirely true. Some men adjusted, others went mad so slowly they didn't notice until the screaming started. Through the barred window, Silas could see the cave entrance, a black mouth in the hillside that swallowed men each morning and spit them out each evening. Beyond it, barely visible in moonlight, lay the road that led north toward the Ohio River and the promise of free states. That was the traditional escape route. Dozens of slaves had tried it over the years. Most were caught within days, returned, and punished in ways that made the other slaves grateful they'd never been brave enough to run. But there was another route, one that no one considered because it seemed like madness. Down. The discovery had happened 2 years earlier, in 1847, by accident. Silas had been hauling a cart of nitrate soil through a section called the Gothic Avenue when his torch began dying. He'd taken a wrong turn in the dimming light, ending up in a narrow side passage he didn't recognize. Instead of turning back immediately, Silas had paused, listening to the peculiar acoustics of the space. The passage descended at a steep angle, and there was a quality to the air, a movement almost imperceptible, that suggested it led somewhere. He'd followed it. The passage narrowed until Silas was crawling on his belly, pushing the dying torch ahead of him, his shoulders scraping limestone on both sides. Any rational person would have turned back, but Silas had learned that rationality was a luxury of the free. The enslaved had to take chances that free men would never risk. After 50 feet of crawling, the passage opened into a chamber, and in that chamber, by the last flickering light of his torch, Silas found bones, human bones, scattered across the floor, partially buried in soft clay soil. A skull, a rib cage, the delicate bones of a hand still clutching something corroded beyond recognition. But what stopped Silas's breath wasn't the bones themselves. It was what he saw on the chamber wall. Writing, carved into the limestone with careful precision. Jackson, Mary, Peter, Caroline, free, 1791. And below it, a symbol, a circle with a vertical line through it and 2 horizontal lines crossing at angles. It looked like a tree, or a map, or a cipher. Silas stood in the perfect darkness after his torch died, his hand tracing the carved letters, understanding something profound. He wasn't the first person to think of going down instead of up. Someone in 1791, 58 years ago, had tried this, had gone deep into the cave seeking freedom. The bones suggested they hadn't succeeded, but the carvings suggested they'd survived long enough to leave a message, a record, a possibility. Silas memorized the symbol and the names, then felt his way back through the narrow passage, using only his hands and his memory of the route. By the time he emerged into the Gothic Avenue, his shift was long over, and Carver was searching for him. The beating was severe, but not crippling. Carver needed Silas functional, but the discovery changed everything. Over the next 2 years, Silas began deliberately mapping the deep passages in his mind, taking small risks during his shifts, extending his routes by a few dozen feet each time, always returning before his absence became suspicious. He found 3 more chambers with carvings, different names, different dates: 1803, 1815, 1829. Always the same symbol, always the word free, and always, eventually, bones. These people had all died down there, but they died free, which was more than most slaves could claim, and they'd survived long enough to travel deep, to explore, to leave records, which meant it was possible to live in the caves, at least for a time, which meant the question wasn't whether it could be done, but how to do it better than those who'd tried before. The decision to actually flee came on September 14th, 1849, not because of any particular brutality, but because of a conversation Silas overheard. He was loading a cart nearby, invisible in the way that slaves learned to be invisible, when Carver spoke to a visitor, a slave trader from Louisville, touring the Franklin Company operations. The cave slaves didn't last as long as field hands, Carver explained. 7, 8 years was about the limit before their lungs gave out. After that, they weren't worth feeding. The company sold them cheap to sugar plantations in Louisiana, where damaged lungs didn't matter much, because slaves rarely lasted more than a few years anyway. Carver glanced at Silas. He'd been here 7 years already, still productive. They'd keep him another year or 2, but after that, Louisiana, probably. They moved on, discussing other workers, other calculations, but Silas had heard enough. 7 years in the caves, maybe 2 more before his lungs failed, then 5 years on a sugar plantation before death. Those were the mathematics of his future. That night, lying on his pallet, Silas calculated different numbers. He had mapped approximately 2 miles of deep passages beyond the company's operations. He had identified 4 chambers large enough to serve as living spaces. He had noted 3 underground streams. Food would be the problem, but he'd been stealing small amounts for months: hardtack, dried meat, salt, hiding it in one of the deep chambers. Not enough to survive indefinitely, but enough for several weeks. And there was the possibility that the deep caves contained resources. Blind cavefish lived in the underground streams. Cave crickets existed in some passages. Mushrooms and fungi grew in the darker, damper areas. The ancient peoples had lived in caves before slavery, before America, before the modern world. If they could do it, perhaps he could too. But there was a larger question. What was the point of living, if living meant waiting for Louisiana? Freedom in darkness seemed preferable to slavery in light. On the morning of September 15th, Silas descended into Mammoth Cave for what appeared to be another routine shift. He carried his usual equipment and, hidden in the lining of his ragged jacket, a small package containing flint, steel, extra candles, and a knife fashioned from broken mining equipment. The plan was simple: work his normal route for the first few hours, establishing his presence. Then, during the midday period, when overseers took their meal break and slaves worked unsupervised, slip away into the deep passages and vanish. The first part went smoothly. Silas worked the Gothic Avenue section, filling his cart, making the usual trips to the collection point. Other slaves moved through passages around him, each focused on their own quotas, their own survival. None of them knew what he was planning. Silas had told no one. In slavery, trust was a luxury that could get people killed. At midday, when the overseer's whistles signaled the break, Silas made his move. Instead of heading toward the entrance, he turned deeper into the cave, moving quickly through the Gothic Avenue toward the narrow passage he'd discovered 2 years earlier. His torch cast wild shadows on limestone walls. Somewhere above him, hundreds of feet of solid rock separated him from the sky. Ahead of him, miles of unexplored darkness waited. Behind him, the only life he'd ever known was ending. Silas reached the narrow passage and got down on his belly, pushing his torch ahead as he crawled into the constrictive space. The limestone scraped his shoulders, his back, his legs. His breathing echoed strangely. 50 feet of crawling. Then the chamber with the bones and the carved message. Silas stood in the larger space, holding his torch high. The bones were still there, scattered and pathetic. The carving still read, Jackson, Mary, Peter, Caroline, free, 1791. He spoke aloud to the dead, his voice strange in the enclosed space, both loud and muffled. He told them he was going further than they did, that he would find what they'd been looking for. He gathered his hidden supplies from where he'd cached them in a crevice, the stolen food, extra candles, a blanket taken from the barracks weeks ago. Then he turned toward the passage that led deeper still, the one he'd only partially explored. This was the point of no return. Once he went deeper than this chamber, he'd be in territory he didn't know, following instinct and hope rather than memory. Silas paused, torch in hand, standing between the carved message of the dead and the unknown darkness ahead. There was still time to turn back, to return to his shift, to claim he'd gotten lost, to accept the beating and return to the slow death of the mines. But then he thought of Louisiana, of sugar plantations and 5-year life expectancies, of dying among strangers, owned until his last breath. And he thought of something else, the possibility that somewhere in this vast underground labyrinth there was a space where a man could exist outside the mathematics of slavery, where the categories of owned and free became meaningless. He descended. The passages beyond the first chamber twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to gaps barely wide enough for Silas's body, sometimes opening into vast halls where his torchlight couldn't reach the ceiling. He marked his route carefully, using his knife to scratch arrows into the limestone at every junction, creating a trail he could follow back if needed. But with each mark, each turn, each descent into deeper darkness, the idea of going back became less real. Forward was the only direction that made sense. Hours passed. Silas's torch burned down, and he lit another. His water ran low. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, heavy with minerals and the weight of the earth above. And then, when he'd begun to wonder if he was simply walking into a stone tomb of his own choosing, the passage opened into something extraordinary. A chamber so vast that his torchlight barely touched its boundaries. The ceiling soared somewhere overhead, lost in darkness, and running through the center was an underground river, wider than any stream he'd seen in the cave system, its water black and swift and ancient. But what stopped Silas in his tracks wasn't the river or the size of the chamber. It was the structure on the far bank. Built from limestone blocks, partially collapsed but still recognizable, was something that could only be described as a building. A deliberate construction with walls and what appeared to be doorways and windows. Someone had built this. Not recently, the construction was clearly ancient, the stone blocks covered in mineral deposits. But at some point, perhaps centuries ago, someone had been down here long enough, with enough resources, to quarry limestone and construct a shelter. Silas moved closer, holding his torch high. Carvings covered the walls of the structure. Not words, but symbols, the same tree-like symbol he'd seen in the first chamber, repeated hundreds of times, along with others, spirals, concentric circles, patterns that might be maps. And then he saw the message that made his breath catch. On the wall nearest the river, carved in letters similar to those in the first chamber, but far more numerous. We built sanctuary. We waited for the others. They never came. If you read this, we are dead. But the sanctuary remains. Go deeper. There is a place where the stone opens to the sky, where water falls from above, where things grow in the light. Follow the river. Stay left. Count 1,000 paces, then look up. Silas read the message 3 times, his torch trembling in his hand. A place where the stone opens to the sky. These people had found a way through, not back the way they'd come, but forward to somewhere else, somewhere with light and water and the possibility of growing things, a place that could sustain life. The implications washed over him. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a route, a path through the mountain to some secret valley or hidden opening where a person could live outside the reach of the slave-holding world. And if it had existed when this message was carved, it might still exist now. Silas stood at the edge of the underground river, in a chamber built by people who'd sought the same freedom he now sought, and made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who hadn't spent 7 years in darkness. He would follow the river. He would count 1,000 paces. He would look up. But first he would do something that the carvers of that message had apparently failed to do. He would go back and bring others. The return journey took 6 hours. Silas followed his scratched markings, moving faster now that he knew the route, driven by a purpose that went beyond personal escape. He emerged in the Gothic Avenue just as the evening shift was ending. The other slaves were trudging toward the entrance, exhausted and silent. The overseers were counting heads, making sure all their property was accounted for. Silas joined the line as if he'd been there all along, his face and clothes no dirtier than anyone else's. No one seemed to notice his absence. That night in the barracks, as others slept or whispered quietly in darkness, Silas lay on his pallet and stared at the ceiling. He had found it. Proof that escape into the deep cave was not only possible, but had been done before. Evidence of a route that led somewhere beyond the mapped world. But he'd also realized something during his return journey. Going alone was the wrong choice. The people who'd built that structure had been a group. They'd understood that freedom in isolation wasn't really freedom. It was just a different kind of prison. Survival required community, required the skills and knowledge of multiple people working together. One man alone in the deep caves might last weeks, but a group working together, they might last indefinitely. They might build something real. Over the next 3 days, Silas carefully approached 4 others. Marcus, still adjusting to cave work but strong and desperate. Ruth, one of the 2 women, who had nursing skills and knew herbs. Old Thomas, who'd been in the caves longer than anyone, and Samuel, a young man barely 20, who'd tried to escape twice already and been brutally punished both times. 4 people, small enough to move quietly, large enough to have a chance at building something sustainable. Approaching them was dangerous. Anyone might refuse and report his plans to the overseers in exchange for better treatment. But the alternative, escaping alone into the deep caves, would make him no different from the bones in that first chamber. By September 20th, Silas had his group. 4 people willing to take a chance on the impossible. They would escape the following night, during the new moon. They would take only what they could carry and descend into the Mammoth Cave system, heading toward an underground river and an ancient message and a promise of a place where stone opened to sky. What they would find there, whether the promised passage still existed, these were unknowns. But staying meant slow death in the mines, or brutal death on a sugar plantation. Going meant possibility. The escape happened with surprising ease. The night of September 21st was moonless and overcast. At midnight, Silas used a piece of wire to pick the simple lock on the barracks door. The 4 others waited in silence, each carrying a small bundle of supplies. They moved through darkness, avoiding main paths, heading directly for the cave entrance. The entrance was typically unguarded at night. Who would be foolish enough to enter the caves in complete darkness? Silas led them into the mouth of the cave and immediately turned away from the usual mining passages. He wouldn't light a candle until they were deep enough that the glow couldn't be seen from the entrance. They walked in perfect darkness for 30 minutes, hands on each other's shoulders, trusting Silas to lead them true. He counted paces, measured distances by memory, turned at junctions he couldn't see but knew were there. Finally, deep enough that no surface light could reach, he stopped and lit a candle. The tiny flame seemed impossibly bright. It illuminated 5 faces, all showing fear, determination, and something else, hope. Silas explained that this was the point where they could still turn back. Once they went further, the route would get harder. Narrow passages, steep climbs, places where the mountain would seem to close in. He couldn't promise what they'd find at the end. No one moved toward the exit. They descended. The journey to the underground river took 8 hours with the group. Marcus struggled with claustrophobia in the narrow passages, requiring several stops to control his breathing. Thomas, despite his experience, was slowed by age and years of hard labor. Ruth and Samuel moved more easily, but the route itself was punishing. But they persevered, and finally emerged into the vast chamber with the underground river. Silas had prepared them, but descriptions couldn't capture the reality of the ancient structure on the far bank. Ruth whispered something that might have been a prayer. They crossed the river carefully, finding a shallow ford where water only reached their thighs. The current was strong, but they held on to each other. On the far bank, in the shadow of the ancient structure, they read the carved message together by candlelight. Samuel asked if Silas thought it was real, the place where stone opened to sky. There was only one way to find out. They rested for an hour, eating small amounts of their supplies, drinking from the underground river. The water was cold and mineral-rich, but clean. Then they followed the carved instructions. Follow the river. Stay left. Count 1,000 paces. Silas counted. The others followed. The passage narrowed and widened, sometimes forcing them to wade through waist-deep water, sometimes opening into galleries where limestone formations hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. At 1,000 paces, Silas stopped and looked up. At first, he saw only the cavern ceiling, perhaps 40 feet overhead. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something odd, a variation in the darkness, a place where the blackness seemed less absolute. He extinguished the candle. In the darkness, they all saw it, a faint glow, so subtle it was almost imaginary, gray rather than black, light, barely perceptible, coming from somewhere far above. Silas relit the candle and examined the chamber walls. On the left side he found a chimney, a vertical shaft rising up through the limestone, wide enough for a person to climb, and carved into the stone at the base. The upward path. Climb slowly. The light grows stronger. At the top is the hidden valley. What we sought, what we built, what remains. The climb took 3 hours. They went one at a time, each person waiting until the one above was safely up before starting. Thomas went first, lightest and most experienced. Then Ruth, then Samuel, then Marcus. Silas went last, carrying the supplies. As he climbed, the darkness gradually lightened, not to day, but to a dim gray twilight that seemed blindingly bright after hours in complete darkness. His hands found the final holds, and he pulled himself up and out of the chimney shaft, into a space that defied everything he'd expected. It wasn't a valley. It was a sinkhole, a massive collapse in the limestone ceiling that had created a shaft approximately 100 feet in diameter, opening to the sky far above. The walls were sheer limestone, unclimbable from inside, but rainwater and sunlight filtered down from the opening, supporting an ecosystem that shouldn't have been possible. Moss covered the walls. Ferns grew in clusters where soil had accumulated. A small pool of water, fed by rainfall and underground seepage, occupied the center. And growing around that pool were plants, actual growing plants, sustained by the indirect sunlight and water. The 4 others stood at the edge of the pool, staring upward at the circle of sky visible hundreds of feet above. Marcus's voice broke as he said, "It was real." Ruth pointed to the remnants of structures built against the sinkhole walls. Crude shelters made from limestone blocks, partially collapsed but still recognizable. Fire pits. Storage areas carved into the rock. Samuel asked how long they'd survived here. Silas was examining the carvings on the nearest wall. More tree symbols, more messages, and finally, a date, 1791 to 1804. 13 years. They'd lived here for 13 years. Thomas asked what happened to them. Silas found another carving, less triumphant. The sickness came. The water turned bad. 3 survived. We climbed out seeking help. God forgive us. They'd survived 13 years in this impossible refuge, only to be defeated by disease and contaminated water. The 3 survivors had attempted to climb out, possibly succeeded, and then what? If they had reached the surface, had they found freedom or recapture? There was no way to know. But they'd survived 13 years. They'd built something here. They'd proven it was possible. Silas turned to face the others. They could do better. They knew what had killed the previous inhabitants. They could prevent that. They could filter water, rotate food sources. They could— Ruth interrupted, holding up her hand, telling them to listen. They all fell silent. From somewhere above, distant but unmistakable, came the sound of dogs barking. The hunt had begun. The barking of the dogs faded within an hour, swallowed by distance and stone. But the sound changed everything. What had been discovery became survival. What had been wonder became calculation. Silas stood at the edge of the underground pool, watching the circle of sky 300 feet above, and understood that finding this refuge was only the beginning. The real challenge was staying alive long enough for refuge to become home. The first week tested them in ways the escape itself had not. Hunger came first. Their stolen supplies, 20 pounds of hardtack, dried meat, and cornmeal, would last perhaps 10 days if rationed severely. After that, they would need to find sustenance from the sinkhole itself, or starve. Silas organized the inventory with the methodical precision of 7 years managing mine equipment. 12 candles, though the sinkhole's natural light reduced their need. 2 blankets, 1 knife, flint and steel, 3 tin cups, a length of rope Marcus had stolen. Against this, he measured their needs: water, food, warmth, security, sanitation. The pool solved water immediately. Silas tested it carefully, drinking small amounts and waiting for illness that never came. The water was clean, mineral-rich, cold enough to numb teeth. One problem eliminated. Light filtered down during daylight hours, creating perpetual twilight, bright enough to see, too dim for detailed work. They would live by a sun they could see but never feel, warming themselves with fire instead of daylight. Fire required fuel. The sinkhole contained plant growth, ferns, moss, small shrubs in accumulated soil pockets, but burning these would destroy resources they might need later. The previous inhabitants' fire pits suggested they'd solved this problem, but how remained unclear. Food was critical. Ruth examined every growing thing with the careful attention of someone whose herbal knowledge might mean the difference between nutrition and poison. She declared the moss edible but not nutritious. Near the pool, Samuel found mushrooms, small, pale, growing in clusters where moisture and dim light created ideal conditions, possibly edible, possibly deadly. They would need to test them. Ruth volunteered, eating a small amount and waiting. 12 hours passed without illness. She ate more. 24 hours, then 48. The mushrooms were safe, though they provided little beyond bulk and a faintly earthy taste. Thomas, despite his age and the arthritis that plagued his joints after decades of mine work, climbed the sinkhole walls with the patience of someone who'd spent his life navigating vertical shafts. 30 feet up, where a collapse had created a shelf of broken limestone, he discovered bird nests, small, built into crevices, containing eggs the size of a child's fist. The question was how to harvest them without falling and breaking every bone in his body. On the 4th day, hunger had sharpened from discomfort to actual pain. The mushrooms filled stomachs but provided no real energy. The last of the dried meat had been consumed. Marcus had fashioned crude snares from plant fiber, hoping to catch the cave crickets that sometimes scuttled along the walls. But the insects were too quick, too wary. Ruth stood at the pool's edge, with a length of cord and a hook she'd shaped from a piece of wire salvaged from Silas's mining tools. She'd been trying to catch fish for hours, dangling the hook in the water, watching pale shapes move in the depths and refuse her bait. The problem was simple. She had nothing to bait the hook with. The fish were blind cave fish, eyeless and translucent, accustomed to feeding on whatever organic matter drifted into the pool. They had no interest in empty metal. Ruth tried everything: bits of mushroom, moss, her own blood squeezed from a deliberately cut finger. The fish ignored all of it. By evening, her hands were cramping from holding the cord, her back aching from hours of crouching. The others had given up watching, turning their attention to other tasks. Samuel carving storage spaces into soft limestone, Marcus maintaining the fire, Thomas resting his climbing-strained muscles. Silas sat nearby, watching Ruth with the quiet intensity of someone calculating how long 5 people could survive on mushrooms and hope. Not long. Perhaps another week before weakness set in, making climbing dangerous, making clear thinking impossible, making the sinkhole a trap instead of a refuge. Ruth adjusted her position, shifted the hook to a different depth, and then, with no warning, the cord jerked in her hands. She pulled, instinct overriding technique, and a fish came thrashing out of the water. Small, barely longer than her hand, pale as milk, and eyeless. It hit the ground and flopped desperately, seeking water it could no longer see. Ruth grabbed it before it could escape, her hands clumsy with excitement and hunger. The fish was slippery, muscular, fighting with surprising strength for something so small. She held it until the thrashing slowed, then stopped. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Proof that the pool could feed them, that survival was possible, that they weren't going to slowly starve in this beautiful, terrible refuge. When she looked up, the others were watching her. Silas saw the same realization on every face. They might actually live through this. Over the next 3 days, Ruth refined her technique. The fish, she discovered, were attracted to movement and vibration rather than scent. A hook jigged through the water at varying depths would eventually attract attention. Patience was essential. She could catch 2, sometimes 3 fish per day. Cleaned and cooked over the fire, they provided protein that made the mushrooms and moss bearable. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough. On the 8th day, while exploring the sinkhole's perimeter, Marcus found the cache. He'd been examining the remnants of the previous inhabitants' structures, limestone blocks fitted together to form walls, fire pits carved into bedrock, storage areas that spoke of long-term habitation rather than temporary shelter. One block sat oddly apart from the others, as if deliberately positioned. Marcus moved it. Beneath was a hollow carved into stone, and in that hollow, wrapped in rotted canvas, was a collection of items. Fish hooks fashioned from bone, a crude net woven from plant fiber, wooden implements of unclear purpose, and a journal. Water damage had destroyed most of it. Pages had fused together, ink had run into illegibility, entire sections had dissolved into pulp, but fragments survived. Silas read them by candlelight that night. The others gathered close, hungry for any information that might help them survive what the journal's author had survived. The handwriting was careful, educated, unusual for a slave, suggesting someone who'd been taught in secret or before enslavement. The dated entries were mostly illegible, but scattered phrases remained. Fish in the pool, small but numerous. Birds nest in the upper reaches during spring months. The ferns cause stomach distress if consumed exclusively. 4 months, and the supplies from above are exhausted, but we do not starve. Mary believes the mushrooms are safe. Most valuable was a crude map on one of the more intact pages. It showed the sinkhole from above, with notations marking water sources, plant growth areas, fishing spots. On the reverse side was something even more interesting, a sketch of the cave system leading to the sinkhole, with additional passages marked that Silas hadn't explored. One passage, marked with the tree symbol he'd seen carved throughout the caves, was labeled in barely legible script, "Exit to surface, 2 days' travel, dangerous." An exit, a way out that didn't require climbing 300 feet of sheer limestone. Silas studied the map until the candle burned low, committing every mark to memory. The implications shifted everything he thought he understood about this place. The previous inhabitants hadn't been trapped here. They'd had a way to leave, to potentially travel to the surface, which meant their residence, the journal's date suggested 13 years, had been at least partially a choice. On another fragment, partially obscured by water damage, he found a possible explanation. Cannot return to slavery. Built something that is ours. The children ask about the sun. Children. There had been children here. The carved names from the first chamber, Jackson, Mary, Peter, Caroline, Free, 1791, weren't for adults, but a family. Parents and children who'd fled into the earth and built a life in twilight. They had survived 13 years, not despite the isolation, but because of what it gave them: autonomy, privacy, ownership of their own time and labor and lives. Ruth, reading over Silas's shoulder, found the final entry on a fragment so damaged it was nearly transparent. The sickness came. Water turned bad. 3 survived. We climbed out, seeking help. So they'd survived 13 years in this impossible refuge, only to be defeated not by recapture, but by disease and contaminated water. 3 survivors had attempted to climb out. Whether they'd found help or capture or death, the journal didn't say. Silas looked around at the others, Marcus, Ruth, Thomas, Samuel, all of them studying the fragments with a mixture of hope and fear. 13 years. It was possible to live here for 13 years. The question was whether they wanted to. Over the following week, as they established routines and solved immediate survival problems, a larger question emerged without anyone explicitly asking it. Was this refuge temporary or permanent? Silas had assumed temporary, a place to hide until pursuit died down, then continue north to free territory. But the Fugitive Slave Act, which Ruth had heard about in the plantation kitchen before their escape, had changed the calculation. Free blacks in northern states now faced constant threat of being kidnapped and returned to slavery. The traditional escape route had become significantly more dangerous. But here, in a sinkhole that no law enforcement could reach, in a community that existed entirely outside the legal framework of the United States, the Fugitive Slave Act was meaningless. Marcus was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. He did it obliquely, while maintaining the fire one evening, asking no one in particular how long they planned to stay. Samuel said until it was safe to leave. Thomas asked what safe meant in a country where black people were property. Ruth pointed out that they'd built something here, crude, difficult, but theirs in a way nothing above ground could ever be. Silas said nothing, because he'd been thinking about the exit route marked on Jackson's map. 2 days' travel to the surface. He needed to see where it led, whether it emerged in slave territory or free territory, whether it was viable for escape or only for supply gathering. He needed to see the sun again. The others understood without him explaining. 7 years in the mines had accustomed him to darkness, but accustomation wasn't preference. He'd chosen down because up was impossible, but given a third option, through, he had to explore it. Silas prepared for a 5-day journey. Dried fish, mushrooms, water, candles, rope, knife, and Jackson's map carefully copied onto limestone with sharpened stone. He descended back into the cave system through the vertical chimney, leaving the sinkhole's dim twilight for absolute darkness. After 2 weeks in perpetual gray light, the darkness felt heavier, more oppressive. His candle seemed fragile, a tiny defiance against crushing stone. The passage marked on Jackson's map led west through chambers that showed no evidence of mining activity. These were virgin passages, untouched by the Franklin Company, known only to whoever had originally mapped this route. The passage descended at first, taking Silas deeper into the mountain, then leveled and began gradual ascent. Water trickled along the floor, flowing east, draining toward the sinkhole. Following water upstream often led to surface openings. The passage narrowed, requiring crawling, then opened into chambers filled with formations, stalactites and stalagmites, flowstone cascades, crystalline structures glittering in candlelight. Silas navigated through without pause, counting paces, marking junctions, maintaining the mental map that would guide his return. He slept twice in the darkness, curled on limestone with his candle extinguished to conserve resources. The silence in these deep passages was profound, not merely absence of sound, but a positive presence of quiet that absorbed even his breathing. On the 3rd day, the passage character changed. The limestone walls showed tool marks, deliberate shaping, widening, floor smoothing. Someone had modified this route to make travel easier. Jackson and his family? Or someone earlier? The air began to move, subtle at first, then definite. Air movement meant openings, connections to surface. Silas extinguished his candle and stood in darkness, feeling slight breeze on his face, smelling something that didn't belong underground. Green growing things, earth, faint wood smoke. He continued in darkness, following the air current, moving slowly with hands extended. The passage ascended steeply, sometimes requiring climbing over rock falls, squeezing through gaps that seemed designed to prevent exactly what he was attempting. And then, after hours or minutes in timeless dark, Silas saw light. Not the gray twilight of the sinkhole, real light, daylight. Yellow-white and blindingly bright, even indirect, reflecting around corners from some opening ahead. He stood motionless, heart hammering, eyes tearing from brightness after days in near darkness. He'd found it, the exit, the way through. But an exit to the surface was only valuable if safe. If it opened into a populated area or onto someone's property, it was a trap rather than escape route. The passage bent sharply, then opened into a final chamber, and there, in the far wall, was the opening, a crack in limestone, perhaps 4 feet high, 2 feet wide, partially hidden behind vines and vegetation. Through it, Silas could see trees, sky, blessed daylight. He approached cautiously, staying in shadow, listening for voices or sounds of human activity. He heard only birds, wind in trees, distant running water. Slowly, ready to retreat at any sign of danger, Silas pushed through the vines and emerged into the world above. He stood at the base of a limestone bluff, in dense forest. The cave opening was set into rock face about 10 feet above a steep slope covered in leaf litter. Well concealed, someone could walk past within 20 feet and never notice the opening behind vegetation. Silas remained motionless for long minutes, allowing his eyes to adjust, listening, watching for any indication of human presence. The sun was overhead, filtered through oak and maple canopy, just beginning to show autumn colors. Birds moved through branches. Somewhere nearby, a stream babbled over rocks. No voices, no dogs, no sounds of civilization. When certain he was alone, Silas climbed down from the bluff and began exploring, moving carefully, staying within sight of the cave opening. The forest was thick, old growth, with massive trees and little undergrowth. The stream was perhaps 100 yards from the bluff, running north. He followed it for a quarter-mile, searching for landmarks, signs, anything that would tell him where he was. He found a road. Barely more than a track, 2 ruts worn by wagon wheels, clearly not heavily traveled. But roads led to civilization, both opportunity and danger. Silas studied it from cover, noting it ran roughly east-west. East would take him back toward the Franklin plantation, west into unknown territory. Moving parallel to the road, but staying in forest, Silas traveled west for perhaps 2 miles. The sun moved across the sky. His unaccustomed eyes ached from brightness. His skin, pale from years underground, felt strange and exposed under open air. Then he saw smoke. A farmstead, small and isolated, set in a clearing. Log cabin with stone chimney, barn, outbuildings, fenced fields where cattle grazed, and most importantly, a clothesline with garments hanging in the breeze. Silas watched from forest edge for over an hour. He saw a white man, middle-aged, working in the barn, a white woman hanging laundry, 2 young children playing near the cabin. No other structures that might house slaves. No dogs visible. No signs of wealth suggesting a slave-holding family. A small family farm, probably worked by people who owned their own land. The question was whether they were sympathetic to fugitives or likely to turn him in for reward. No way to know without taking a risk. As afternoon moved toward evening, Silas made his decision. He wouldn't approach the farm, too dangerous, but he would steal clothing from the line, items that would allow him to travel more freely above ground. His ragged mine clothes marked him immediately as a slave. Better clothing might give the appearance of a free black, at least from distance. He waited until full dark, then moved silently across the cleared field. The garments had been taken in hours earlier, but he found what he needed in the barn, work clothes, probably belonging to the farmer, a hat, worn boots close to his size. He also found food, a half-wheel of cheese, bread, apples from a storage barrel. He took small amounts, enough to supplement supplies, but not enough to be immediately noticed. Back in the forest, dressed in stolen clothes that fit poorly but were infinitely better than slave rags, Silas began the return journey to the cave entrance, his mind racing with possibilities. The exit was viable. It opened into sparsely populated forest, far from main roads or towns. The farm suggested this was still Kentucky, slave territory, but the isolation suggested marginal land where people minded their own business. If Jackson's map was accurate and Silas's navigation correct, this exit was approximately 40 miles northwest of the Franklin plantation. 40 miles of forest and hill country, difficult to search thoroughly.
and if they traveled west from here, they might reach the Ohio River within days. The Ohio River, the boundary between slavery and freedom. Silas stood at the cave entrance as last light faded, looking back at the forest, breathing air that smelled of growing things and freedom, feeling autumn wind on his face. Then he turned and descended back into darkness, back toward the sinkhole, back to the others who waited for news. He had found the way through. Now the question was, what to do with it. The return journey took 2 days.
When Silas emerged through the chimney into the sinkhole's perpetual twilight, the others gathered with questions in their eyes. He told them everything: the viable exit, the forest isolation, the farm, the stolen clothes, the distance to potential freedom. He spread out Jackson's map and his own additions, showing the route, explaining challenges and opportunities. Then he presented them with a choice. They could leave. Within a week, they could be traveling west toward the Ohio River, toward free territory, toward possibility of building lives in the open world. The exit existed. The path was clear. Or they could stay. The sinkhole had proven sustainable. They had food, water, shelter, security. They had autonomy, limited by geography, but absolute within those limits. No master, no overseer, no auction block, no threat of being sold away from each other. Here, in this twilight world, they were as free as it was possible for escaped slaves to be in 1850. Silas had expected immediate enthusiasm for leaving, but the reaction was more complicated. Ruth pointed out that free blacks in northern states faced their own challenges. They could be kidnapped and returned under the Fugitive Slave Act. They faced discrimination, limited opportunities, constant suspicion. Freedom above ground came with costs. Thomas noted that the sinkhole offered something increasingly rare, a place where black people could exist entirely outside white control. No laws, no restrictions, no oversight, just 5 people governing themselves. Marcus was most conflicted. He needed the sun. His weeks in the sinkhole had made this painfully clear. But he also recognized that leaving meant returning to a world where his freedom would always be provisional, always subject to challenge. Only Samuel was unequivocally ready to leave. He'd escaped to find freedom, and freedom meant the North, meant living in the open world, meant more than survival in a hole in the ground. The discussion continued for days, and as they talked, a third option emerged. What if they did both? What if the sinkhole became not permanent residence, but a base, a refuge they could leave and return to, a safe haven that would always be there if the above-ground world became too dangerous? What if they used the exit route not for permanent escape, but for strategic access to the surface, for gathering supplies, for making contact with the wider world, for helping other fugitives find this sanctuary? The idea transformed the conversation. The sinkhole wasn't a prison or final destination. It was a resource, infrastructure in what was already being called the Underground Railroad, and in this case, the name would be literal. But implementing this vision would require something they hadn't yet attempted, going back toward danger rather than away from it. The plan emerged over the next week. Silas would return to the surface, but not to flee north. Instead, he would travel carefully back toward the Franklin plantation to make contact with the remaining slaves there. The goal was twofold. First, to let them know escape was possible, that there was a route and refuge the slaveholders knew nothing about. Second, to establish a communication system, a way for information and people to flow between plantation and sinkhole. It was the opposite of what escaped slaves were supposed to do. Fugitives fled and kept running. They didn't circle back. They didn't return to the vicinity of their former captivity. But Silas had realized something during his weeks in the sinkhole. The traditional model of escape, running north as fast as possible, only saved individuals. If they wanted to save more people, to build something larger than their own freedom, they needed to create infrastructure. They needed to build a network. Ruth supported this with practical observation. They had knowledge and resources that could help others survive the journey to freedom. The sinkhole could shelter multiple groups.
The exit route could be used repeatedly. They could become a station on the Underground Railroad, perhaps the most unusual station ever established. Thomas pointed out the risks. Every return to surface, every contact with other slaves, every expansion of their network increased chances of discovery. Eventually, someone would betray them or make a mistake or simply get unlucky. But Samuel had the final word. If they built nothing, helped no one, saved only themselves, then what was the point? Survival without purpose was just delayed death. So on a cold morning in late October 1850, 8 weeks after their initial escape, Silas Holloway made his second escape from the sinkhole. But this time he was escaping outward, not fleeing, but advancing, moving from safety toward danger with a purpose that went beyond his own freedom. He carried supplies, information, and a message. There is a way. Follow the symbols. Go down when they expect you to go up. And at the end of the deepest darkness, there is light. The journey back toward the Franklin plantation took 4 days of careful travel. Silas moved mostly at night, avoiding roads, staying in densest forest cover, using the stolen farmer's clothes to appear as a free black if spotted from distance. He had no clear plan for making contact. Walking up to the barracks would result in immediate capture. But he knew the plantation rhythms, knew where slaves might be without direct supervision, knew the quiet moments when brief conversations were possible. He approached at dawn on the 5th day, positioning himself near forest edge where logging crews sometimes worked. Slaves cutting timber for mine supports, supervised but not closely watched. Silas waited in undergrowth, watching work crews arrive. He recognized several faces. Then he saw someone he knew, Isaac, a young man who'd worked briefly in the mines before being transferred to field labor. Quick-witted, observant, with a reputation for noticing things others missed. Silas waited until Isaac moved away from the main group, ostensibly gathering fallen branches. Then he made a soft sound, a bird call that didn't quite match any actual bird. Isaac froze, then slowly turned his head, scanning the forest edge. Silas showed himself briefly, just long enough for Isaac to see his face, then melted back into shadow. Isaac continued gathering branches, moving gradually closer to forest edge. When he was within earshot, but not sight of other workers, he spoke without looking in Silas's direction, his voice barely audible. "Where the hell you been? They think you dead. All of you dead." Silas kept his voice equally low. "Not dead. Found something. A place. Safe. Can bring others."
Isaac's hands didn't stop moving, gathering branches, maintaining the appearance of work. "You crazy coming back here? They catch you, they'll make an example. Need you to pass a message. To anyone thinking about running, there's a route they don't know about. Through the caves, goes deep, comes out far away. How many you taken through?" "4. All alive, all safe. Can take more." Silence. Then, "There's a new girl in the kitchen. Hannah. Come from South Carolina 3 weeks ago. She got a child, maybe 5 years old. Thornton talking about selling the child separate. Training farm in Alabama." Silas felt his chest tighten. "When?" "Soon. Maybe days. Girl tried to run last week. Got caught before she reached the road. They whipped her, but not too bad. Don't want to damage merchandise before selling the child. Can you get her a message?" Isaac finally glanced toward Forrest, just for a second. "I can try. What should I tell her?" "Tell her there's a way out that doesn't involve roads or dogs. Tell her to watch for a signal. When she sees it, she needs to trust and move fast." "What signal?" Silas remembered the symbol from Jackson's journal, the tree mark that appeared throughout the cave carvings. "Tell her to watch the cave entrance at dawn. If she sees a mark carved into the stone, looks like a tree, circle with lines through it, that means it's time. She should go into the cave that night. Don't follow mine passages. Go right at first junction, then down. I'll mark the route. I'll be waiting." Isaac gathered the last of his branches. "This is crazy, Silas." Silas smiled in shadows. "Crazy is staying and watching children get sold. This is just dangerous." Isaac walked away without another word, rejoining the logging crew. From distance, the entire conversation would have looked like a slave gathering firewood. Nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating. Silas waited until the crew moved to a different area, then retreated deeper into forest. The first part was complete. The message was delivered. Now he needed to prepare the route and hope Isaac would follow through, that Hannah would trust the message, that she would have courage to take her child into darkness when every instinct would scream to run toward light. Over the next 2 days, Silas prepared the route with meticulous care. He carved the tree symbol at every junction where a choice of direction was necessary. He cleared obstacles where possible, widened tight passages slightly, left small caches of candles at strategic points. He also left written messages carved into soft limestone. "Follow the marks. Do not stop. Do not go back. Freedom is down." On the 3rd day, he carved the signal symbol into limestone wall next to the cave entrance. A circle with a vertical line through it, 2 horizontal lines crossing at angles. The tree of freedom pointing the way into darkness. Then he descended into the cave and waited. Hannah came that night with her daughter clutching her hand. Silas heard them before he saw them. Uncertain footsteps, a child's whispered question, a mother's urgent whisper to be quiet. He'd positioned himself in the Gothic Avenue section, far enough from entrance that any pursuit wouldn't reach quickly, close enough that a frightened woman and child wouldn't get lost before finding him. He lit a candle so they could see, held his hands out to show he was unarmed, spoke softly. The woman was young, perhaps 20,
with the wary expression of someone who'd learned to trust nothing. The child was small for 5 years old, thin, with enormous eyes that took in everything. Hannah stared at Silas, her free hand clenched into a fist, ready to fight or flee. The child pressed against her mother's legs. Silas kept his voice calm. He told Hannah his name, told her Isaac had passed the message, told her the route would be hard but manageable, told her that at the end there was a place where she and her daughter would be safe. Hannah listened without interrupting. When Silas finished, she asked only one question. "This a trick? You working for Thornton?" Silas understood the suspicion. He pointed to his own face, to scars on his hands, to the telltale signs of mine work. Told her he'd worked the Mammoth Cave mines for 7 years. Told her he'd escaped 2 months ago with 4 others. Told her they'd found a place inside the cave system that the white men didn't know existed. And then he told her the thing no slave working for the master would ever say. "If you don't trust me, go back, right now. I won't stop you. But if you go back, your daughter gets sold in 3 days." Isaac heard Carver talking about it. They already got a buyer. Hannah's jaw clenched. Her daughter looked up at her, on the verge of tears. Finally, Hannah nodded once. "We go." The journey to the sinkhole took 12 hours with a 5-year-old child. They had to stop frequently for the girl to rest, to drink, to overcome moments when darkness and enclosed spaces became overwhelming. Silas carried the child for long stretches, feeling her small weight on his back, her arms around his neck, her trust both precious and terrifying. The narrow passage where Silas had to crawl on his belly was worst. He went through first, then called back instructions to Hannah. She had to push her daughter ahead of her through the constrictive space, the child whimpering but not crying, understanding somehow that silence was survival. 50 feet of crawling with limestone scraping shoulders and back and legs, 50 feet of hearing the child's frightened breathing echoing in the tight space, 50 feet of wondering if this was cruelty rather than rescue, if he was leading them into a trap of stone and darkness rather than freedom. But they emerged into the first chamber, then continued down, past the carved messages from those who'd come before, past the bones of those who hadn't made it all the way. They reached the underground river as dawn was breaking above ground, though no light reached this deep. Crossed at the shallow ford, with Silas carrying the child so she wouldn't be swept away by current. Climbed the vertical chimney with the girl strapped to Silas's back, Hannah climbing below them, all of them moving slowly, carefully, knowing that a fall from even 20 feet could be fatal. The child was crying silently by the time they reached the top, her small body shaking with exhaustion and fear. Silas felt her tears soaking into his stolen shirt. And finally emerged into the sinkhole's perpetual twilight, where Ruth and Thomas and Marcus and Samuel waited with food and water and blankets. The child stared up at the circle of sky far above, at the green plants growing around the pool, at the moss-covered walls. She turned to her mother with wonder in her eyes. "Is this heaven?" Hannah, exhausted and shaking, looked around at the impossible space, at the other escaped slaves who'd built a life here. She looked at Silas with something like gratitude mixed with disbelief.
Not heaven, but maybe not hell either. Maybe something in between. Over the following days, as Hannah and her daughter, whose name was Lily, adjusted to the sinkhole, Silas understood that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer 5 fugitives hiding in a hole. They were 7 people building a community. And if 7 was possible, then 8 was possible. Then 10. Then 20. The sinkhole could support more. The cave system was vast. The exit route allowed access to the surface for supplies and recruitment. They could build something unprecedented, a free black community in the heart of slave territory, invisible to the very system that claimed to own them. But building this would require what Silas had just done, returning again and again to the surface, making contact, bringing people through. It would require transforming from fugitives who'd successfully escaped into conductors on an underground railroad that was literally underground. His second escape, the escape outward from the sinkhole, had been successful. He'd found the exit, stolen supplies, made contact with Isaac, brought Hannah and Lily to safety. But it was only the beginning. The real work, the dangerous work, the work that would either save dozens of people or get them all killed, was just starting. And Silas, standing at the edge of the pool in the perpetual twilight, watching Lily play with the careful freedom of a child who was learning what safety felt like, understood that he would need to escape again. Not down this time, not outward, but back to the Franklin plantation, back to the place of his enslavement, back to the people who still lived under the control he'd fled, because the network they were building could save dozens, perhaps hundreds, but there were thousands still enslaved, and the only way to save more was to teach them that freedom existed underground, in places the slaveholders didn't know existed, following routes that no dogs could track. His third escape would be the most dangerous, an escape back into slavery, for the explicit purpose of teaching others how to escape. It would also be, if it succeeded, the escape that transformed a hidden refuge into a movement. There are 3 kinds of escape. The first is flight, running from chains toward freedom, driven by desperation and hope. The second is expansion, building something in the space that flight has opened, transforming survival into life. The third kind is the hardest, and makes no sense to anyone who hasn't lived under bondage. The escape back into the place you fled, carrying freedom with you like a contagion, like a gospel, like a weapon slaveholders can't see until it's already spreading. Silas Holloway made his third escape in the spring of 1851, 6 months after bringing Hannah and Lily to the sinkhole. This escape would be measured not in miles traveled, but in how many people he could convince that down was the direction of freedom, and whether he could teach them the route before the slaveholders understood what he was building. The community in the sinkhole had grown to 9 people by March. After Hannah and Lily came Isaac himself, who'd passed the original message and then realized he'd helped others escape but remained enslaved. Then 2 field hands from a neighboring plantation, brothers named Daniel and Joseph, who'd heard whispered rumors about a route through the caves. 9 people meant establishing routines, assigning responsibilities, managing resources with the care of those who understood that waste meant death. Ruth had mastered fishing in the underground pool, catching 5 or 6 blind cave fish daily. Thomas climbed the sinkhole walls to harvest bird eggs, despite his age-stiffened joints. Samuel and the brothers carved additional living spaces into the limestone. Marcus maintained the fires. Hannah made the harsh reality of underground life slightly more bearable with her domestic skills. Isaac had appointed himself chronicler, carving a record of their community into the sinkhole wall. Names, dates, important events, a history that would survive even if they didn't. But 9 people was still only 9 people, and every week more slaves were sold, separated from families, worked to death. The sinkhole could support 20, possibly 30 with careful management, which meant Silas needed to go back. Not for a quick recruitment visit, but for something more systematic and far more dangerous. He needed to return to the Franklin plantation itself. Hannah had brought news that changed Silas's understanding of their vulnerability. The Franklin Company had noticed the missing slaves. 5 people disappearing simultaneously was impossible to miss. But according to what she'd heard, the company believed the fugitives had fled north, using the traditional escape route through Kentucky countryside toward the Ohio River. They'd sent slave catchers with dogs to search roads and forests north of the plantation. They'd posted notices offering rewards. They'd questioned other slaves. But they hadn't searched the caves. Why would they? The Mammoth Cave system was a workplace, not an escape route. The idea that someone would flee deeper into the very place that imprisoned them apparently hadn't occurred to anyone. This was their greatest protection, the slaveholders' inability to imagine that anyone would choose down over up, darkness over light. But this protection was fragile. One mistake, one captured fugitive who revealed the route under torture, and the entire network would be compromised. Silas needed to expand the network quickly while the route remained secret, and establish backup refuges so discovery of the sinkhole wouldn't destroy everything they'd built. Silas emerged from the cave exit on a cold morning in late March. The forest was awakening to spring, birds returning, buds appearing on trees, first green shoots pushing through leaf litter. He'd been underground for most of winter, and the seasonal change was disorienting. The plan was dangerous. Position himself near the Franklin plantation for 2 weeks, making contact with as many slaves as possible, passing information about the underground route, identifying viable candidates for escape. He would not be reckless, would not approach anyone where conversation could be overheard, would not push the uncertain or potentially untrustworthy. But he would plant seeds, would let people know the impossible was possible. The Franklin plantation looked exactly as Silas remembered. The main house with white-painted columns, the barracks, the cave entrance like a black mouth swallowing workers each morning. Silas watched from the forest edge, studying patterns of movement and supervision. The rhythms hadn't changed. What had changed was his perspective. 6 months ago, he'd been part of this system. Now he watched from outside, seeing it for what it was, a machine designed to extract labor while destroying the people who provided it. He waited 3 days before making his first contact. The logging crews remained the best option, slaves working in relative isolation, supervised but not constantly watched. On the 4th morning, Silas positioned himself near where a young man named Marcus was gathering branches at the forest edge. The bird call that wasn't quite right, the brief appearance, the slow, careful approach. This other Marcus was perhaps 18, muscular from field labor, with the wary intelligence of someone who'd learned survival required constant vigilance.
When Silas revealed himself, speaking quietly from forest shadows, the young man's hand moved toward the axe at his belt before recognition stopped him. "You're dead. They said you were dead." Silas explained the route in barest terms, not full instructions, those would come later, but enough to establish this wasn't fantasy, that multiple people had successfully escaped using this route, that they were living in safety, building a community, and could bring others. The young Marcus listened without interrupting, hands continuing to gather branches, eyes scanning to ensure they weren't observed. When Silas finished, the young man voiced the question Silas had expected. He had a sister, 12 years old, working in the main house. If he went, he couldn't leave her. Silas told him to bring her. The route was hard, but she was young enough to manage it. They'd brought children through already. The young Marcus asked how he could know this wasn't a test, some trap set by the overseers. Silas pulled up his sleeve, showing the scars on his forearm, distinctive marks from 7 years handling mining tools in the deep passages. No informant would have these marks. The young man studied the scars, then nodded slowly. If he decided to try this, how would he start? Watch the cave entrance at dawn for the tree mark carved into stone. When you see it, come that night. Bring your sister, water, whatever food you can carry. Don't tell anyone unless you trust them with your life. Over the next 10 days, Silas made contact with 6 more plantation slaves, each conversation following the same careful pattern. He didn't push, didn't try to convince the reluctant. 2 were clearly interested. 3 were uncertain. 1 was actively fearful, convinced it was a trap. But it was the 7th contact that changed everything. Elizabeth worked in the main house as Mrs. Thornton's personal servant, perhaps 30, with the careful, controlled demeanor of someone who'd survived by becoming invisible, by anticipating needs before they were spoken. She'd heard whispers about Silas and had positioned herself in the forest during a rare moment when she'd been sent to gather herbs. When Silas appeared from the shadows, she showed no surprise, no fear, just looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who'd already made a decision. She told him she needed to get out, not for herself, for her daughter. 8 years old. Thornton had been looking at the girl in ways that meant she had maybe a year before. Elizabeth's voice didn't waver, but her hands clenched. She wouldn't let that happen. She'd kill him first, or she'd get her daughter out. Silas understood. He'd heard these stories whispered in the quarters. Light-skinned slave children faced particular horrors. The route was difficult with a child that young, but they'd done it before. The hardest part was the narrow passage and the vertical climb. But if the girl was small and strong, she was both, and she'd do whatever Elizabeth told her because she knew what was at stake. Elizabeth asked when they could go. Watch for the signal. The tree mark at the cave entrance. Elizabeth gathered her herbs and prepared to return to the main house. Before she left, she said something Silas would remember long after. "You know what you're building down there? You're building proof. Proof that we can survive without masters. That's worth more than individual freedom." The signal went up on April 2nd, 1851. Silas carved the tree symbol into the limestone wall next to the cave entrance before dawn, then retreated to the forest to watch. 3 groups came that night. The young Marcus arrived first with his 12-year-old sister Sarah just after sunset, moving quickly, carrying small bundles. 2 hours later came a woman named Ruth with her 2 teenage sons. They'd traveled from a neighboring plantation, following instructions passed through the slave communication network. And finally, near midnight, came Elizabeth with her 8-year-old daughter Grace, moving with the careful silence of people who understood discovery meant death. Silas waited until certain no slave catchers were following, then entered the caves, descending to meet the incoming fugitives. He found them in the Gothic Avenue section, clustered in dim candlelight, fear and hope mixing on their faces. 11 people, 3 adults, 8 children counting the teenagers, the largest group he'd attempted to guide through at once. The risk of discovery had increased dramatically, but so had the potential. If he could get 11 people through safely, it would prove the route could handle larger groups, prove the network could scale beyond individual escapes. Silas gathered them and explained what came next. The narrow passages they'd crawl through, the underground river they'd cross, the vertical chimney requiring climbing skills most didn't have. Hours of walking in darkness so complete it felt like physical pressure. And at the end, a place where they'd be safe, where they could build lives that belonged to them, where their children could grow up free. He could see doubt on some faces, fear, the calculation of whether this unknown horror was better or worse than the known horror they were fleeing. But he also saw determination, the desperate courage of people who decided any chance was better than no chance. They descended together into the deeper darkness. The journey became a nightmare within the first hour. The narrow passage where Silas had to crawl on his belly became a bottleneck of terror. The younger children couldn't understand why they had to squeeze through spaces barely wider than their bodies, couldn't comprehend that the only way forward was through crushing tightness that made breathing difficult. Sarah became hysterical halfway through, her screams echoing in the confined space, her body thrashing in panic that made her stick more firmly. Her brother had to talk her through it, his voice calm despite his own fear, telling her to exhale completely, to make herself small, to focus on the light ahead rather than the stone pressing in from all sides. It took 30 minutes to get her through a passage that should have taken 5. Grace, Elizabeth's daughter, handled it better than some adults. She was small enough that the tightest sections didn't require the same contortions, and she'd apparently developed the ability to dissociate from fear, to simply do what she was told without questioning. Silas recognized this ability. He'd seen it in other slave children who'd learned early that survival meant emotional disconnection. The underground river presented different challenges. The water was cold enough to steal breath, the current strong enough to sweep away anyone who lost footing. Silas carried the smaller children across on his back, making multiple trips while the others waited, shivering in wet clothes that would take hours to dry. One of Ruth's teenage sons, Jacob, slipped on slick limestone and went under. The current pulled him downstream before his mother could grab him. Silas dove into the black water, feeling blindly for the boy's thrashing form. The cold hit like a fist, driving air from his lungs. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, pulling him sideways, disorienting him in the absolute darkness. His hand caught fabric. He grabbed, pulled, felt the boy's weight, kicked toward where the bank should be. His shoulder hit stone. He pulled again, harder, fighting the current that wanted to sweep them both downstream into passages that might not have air pockets, that might trap them underwater until they drowned. His feet found purchase on the riverbed. He stood, hauling Jacob up, gasping, coughing. Hands reached from the bank, pulling them both onto solid ground. Jacob vomited water, shaking violently from cold and shock. His mother held him, her own body trembling. Silas lay on the limestone, breathing hard, understanding how close they'd come to their first death. How fragile this entire operation was, how one moment of bad luck could transform rescue into tragedy. They rested for 20 minutes, letting Jacob recover enough to continue. No one spoke. The near drowning had made the danger real in a way that Silas's warnings hadn't. When they continued, everyone moved more carefully. The playfulness that had characterized some of the younger children earlier was gone, replaced by grim focus. The vertical chimney was the final test. Silas rigged a rope system, creating a crude safety line that would at least prevent a fatal fall. Then he talked each person through the climb, positioning himself to provide guidance and catch them if they slipped. The teenage boys went first, young and strong enough to muscle through. Then the adults, the young Marcus, Ruth, Elizabeth, each fighting exhaustion and fear to make the 100-foot ascent. Then the younger children, Sarah, Grace, Ruth's younger son, Thomas. Grace nearly fell at the 70-foot mark. Her hand missed a hold. Her foot slipped. For a terrible moment, she was hanging by one hand, her small body swinging over the void. Her fingers were slipping, the limestone too smooth, her strength giving out. Silas was 3 feet below her. He lunged upward, his own position precarious, one hand locked on a hold, the other reaching for the girl. His fingers closed around her wrist, just as her grip failed completely. Her weight pulled him sideways. For a sickening moment, they were both hanging from Silas's single handhold, his shoulder screaming with the strain, his fingers cramping around the limestone edge. The rope. He still had the rope. His other hand found it, wrapped it around his wrist, took some of the weight. He pulled Grace against him, talking to her quietly, forcing calm into his voice, despite the terror flooding through him. Find the hold. Left hand, up and left. Feel it? Small fingers scrabbled against stone, found purchase. Now your foot. Straight down, there's a ledge. Her foot found it. Some of her weight came off his arm. His shoulder stopped screaming quite so loudly. Together they climbed the last 30 feet, Silas staying directly below her, ready to catch her again if she fell. When they finally reached the top and pulled themselves over the edge into the sinkhole's twilight, Silas's entire body was shaking. Elizabeth grabbed her daughter, held her close, her face pressed against the girl's hair. She didn't thank Silas. There were no words adequate for what had just happened. But when she looked at him, her expression said everything. When the last person emerged, all 11 of them exhausted and traumatized and alive, the original community was waiting with food and water and blankets. 20 people now lived in the hidden refuge. 20 people who'd chosen darkness over slavery, who'd trusted Silas's impossible promise that down led to freedom. But the journey had revealed something Silas hadn't wanted to acknowledge. They'd been lucky. Grace should have fallen. Jacob should have drowned. Sarah should have gotten stuck in the narrow passage and suffocated. They'd survived through luck as much as skill. And luck didn't scale. The next group might not be so fortunate. The Franklin Company's response to the second mass disappearance was swift and brutal. Silas heard about it 2 weeks later from Isaac, who'd maintained contact with slaves still on the plantation.
The overseers had questioned every remaining slave, using methods ranging from threats to actual torture. They'd brought in professional slave catchers from Tennessee. They'd searched the forests for miles, and they'd finally searched the caves. But they'd searched wrong, assuming fugitives would use caves as temporary hiding before continuing north. They'd searched tourist sections and active mining areas, gone perhaps a quarter-mile into the deep passages before darkness and the risk of getting lost drove them back. They hadn't found the marked route, hadn't discovered the narrow passage, hadn't found the sinkhole. But the fact that they'd searched the caves at all meant the protection of invisibility was eroding. However, something else had happened during the search that Silas only learned about later, from a field hand who'd been forced to guide the slave catchers into the cave entrance. One of the searchers, a professional tracker named Coleman, who'd hunted fugitives for 20 years, had noticed something the overseers missed. He'd found one of Silas's marks, a tree symbol carved into limestone near a junction in the passages. He'd pointed it out to the overseer leading the search, suggesting they follow it to see where it led. The overseer had dismissed it as meaningless, probably carved by slaves during work shifts, graffiti with no significance. They'd continued searching the main passages instead, but Coleman hadn't been convinced. According to the field hand, he'd taken a piece of charcoal and copied the symbol, said he'd seen something similar in Tennessee, in a case involving a network of fugitives using marked trails. Coleman had left the plantation after 3 days of fruitless searching, but he'd taken the copied symbol with him, and he told the overseer that if more slaves disappeared, they should consider the possibility that the escape route wasn't north at all, but somewhere they hadn't thought to look. When Silas heard this, standing in the sinkhole's twilight with 20 people who trusted him to keep them safe, he understood that their time was running out faster than he'd anticipated. Silas called a gathering to discuss the implications. 20 people sat in the perpetual twilight, the original 5, plus Hannah and Lily, Isaac, the brothers Daniel and Joseph, and the 11 who'd arrived in the mass escape. They ranged in age from 8 to perhaps 50, represented 5 different plantations. Silas laid out the situation with brutal honesty. The route was compromised, not discovered, but suspected. A professional slave catcher had noticed the marks and recognized them as potentially significant. Every additional escape increased the risk that someone would figure it out. If the sinkhole was found, there would be no warning, no time to flee. They'd be trapped 300 feet underground. The prudent course was to stop bringing people through, to obscure the marked route and survive on what they'd already built. But Elizabeth raised the counter-argument that would define the community's future. She pointed out they'd saved 20 people, 20 out of thousands, 20 out of tens of thousands enslaved across Kentucky and surrounding states. If they stopped now, they'd preserve their own freedom but abandon everyone else. Was that really the kind of freedom they wanted? Safety purchased at the cost of others' suffering? The debate lasted hours and revealed deep divisions. Some argued for preservation and security. They'd built something precious and fragile. Why risk it for people who might betray them, who might lead slaveholders directly to their refuge? Others argued for expansion and mission. What was the point of freedom if it was hoarded rather than shared? Ruth pointed out a practical concern. The sinkhole could support perhaps 30 people maximum with their current resource base. They were already at 20. There was a limit to how many they could save. But Isaac raised a possibility that reframed everything. What if there were other sinkholes?
Silas had explored only a fraction of the cave system. Jackson's journal had mentioned other passages, other potential refuges.
What if they could find and develop additional underground communities? What if instead of one sinkhole supporting 30 people, they created a network of sinkholes, each supporting its own group, all connected by cave passages? It would require massive exploration and resource investment, but it would solve both problems. They could continue rescuing people without overwhelming any single refuge, and they could create redundancy so discovery of one location wouldn't destroy the entire network. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. Several advocated for caution, for stopping rescues until they'd secured their current position. But the majority agreed. They would continue bringing people through while simultaneously exploring to find and develop additional refuges. Samuel, who'd been quiet through most of the debate, made the observation that settled remaining doubts. "We're already committed. The moment we brought the first person through after ourselves, we committed to being more than just successful fugitives. We became conductors. The only question is whether we do this halfway or completely." But before Silas could begin the deep exploration the community had agreed upon, he needed to address the immediate threat. Coleman, the slave catcher who'd noticed the marks. If Coleman returned to the Franklin plantation, and professional trackers often revisited cases where they'd been unsuccessful, he might search more carefully, might follow the marked route, might discover everything. The marks needed to be changed or obscured in a way that would confuse anyone following them while remaining clear to those who knew what to look for. Silas returned to the surface alone, traveling through the exit route to the forest, then carefully approaching the cave entrance under cover of darkness. The tree symbol he'd carved as a signal was still there, obvious on the limestone wall. He began chipping away at it, altering the pattern, making it look like natural erosion or damage rather than a deliberate mark. Then he entered the caves and began the painstaking work of modifying every mark he'd made. Some he obscured completely. Others he changed to different symbols that would mean nothing to someone who didn't know the new code. At key junctions, he created false marks that led to dead ends or dangerous passages. The work took 3 days of careful navigation through passages that were becoming dangerously familiar. Familiarity bred carelessness, and carelessness in the caves meant death. On the second day, while working deep in the system, Silas heard voices. He extinguished his candle immediately, pressing himself against the limestone wall, controlling his breathing, listening. 2 men, maybe 3, moving through the passages with the heavy footsteps of people unfamiliar with cave navigation. Their voices echoed strangely, making it difficult to judge distance, but they were close, too close. One voice was giving directions, the other was questioning them. A third, quieter voice was doing something that made scratching sounds against stone, copying the marks. They were following the route and copying the symbols. Silas waited in absolute darkness, not moving, barely breathing. The voices came closer, then seemed to pause at a junction, perhaps 50 feet from where he stood. A light appeared, flickering torchlight painting shadows on the cave walls. Silas could see their silhouettes now. 3 men, one holding a torch, one carrying what looked like a rifle, one sketching on paper. They were at the junction where the marked route split from the main passage. Silas had already obscured the mark here, but had they seen it before he'd changed it? The man with the paper was studying the wall, running his hands over the limestone where Silas's mark had been. He said something Silas couldn't quite hear. The man with the rifle responded, his tone impatient. They argued briefly. Then, to Silas's horror, they chose the correct passage. Even without the mark, they were following the route, guided by what? Intuition? Evidence Silas had missed? Marks he hadn't obscured yet? Silas had three choices: retreat deeper into the caves and hope they gave up before reaching the sinkhole, follow them and try to create a distraction that would turn them back, or stay hidden and let them go, then return to warn the community. The first option felt like cowardice. The second was suicidally risky. The third meant the community would have only hours of warning before armed men potentially reached the sinkhole. He chose the second option. Silas moved silently through a parallel passage, one that ran roughly alongside the route the men were following. The cave system here had multiple passages that connected and diverged, a maze that was navigable if you knew the landmarks, but deadly confusing for newcomers. He positioned himself ahead of the men, in a section where the passage narrowed and the ceiling dropped low. Then he created noise. Not loud noise, that would be too obviously human, but small sounds, rocks shifting, water dripping in an irregular pattern, the sound of something moving in darkness just beyond the reach of their torchlight. The men stopped. Silas could hear their nervous conversation, the tone shifting from confident to uncertain. Cave acoustics made sounds behave strangely, made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Silas created more sounds, from different directions now, using his knowledge of how echoes worked in these spaces. Made it seem like something was circling them, just out of sight. One of the men wanted to continue. Another wanted to retreat. The third, the one with the paper, the one who'd been copying marks, was silent, listening. Silas picked up a small rock and threw it into a side passage, creating a clattering sound that echoed through multiple chambers. That decided it. The men turned back, moving quickly now, their confident exploration replaced by nervous flight. Silas waited until their footsteps faded, then continued his work obscuring marks, his heart racing from the close call. They would return. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but eventually. And next time they might bring more men, more lights, more determination. The community's time in the sinkhole was running out. When Silas returned to the sinkhole and reported what had happened, the mood shifted from hopeful expansion to urgent preparation. They had months at most before the caves were searched more thoroughly, weeks if they were unlucky, and when that search came, they needed alternatives, which meant the deep exploration couldn't wait. Silas needed to find other sinkholes, other refuges, and he needed to find them immediately. He prepared for the longest journey he'd yet attempted. 30 days of supplies, the most sophisticated mapping tools they could create, and a promise to return, because the community needed him alive more than they needed heroic discoveries. But before he could depart, Elizabeth approached him privately, away from the others, her expression troubled.
She'd been thinking about the slave catcher who'd copied the symbols, about the men Silas had frightened away. She'd been thinking about what would happen when they returned with more searchers, with dogs perhaps, with the determination of people who knew they were close to something valuable. The community needed a guardian, she said, someone who would stay near the surface, watching the cave entrance, ready to warn if searchers came. Someone who could create diversions, false trails, obstacles that would slow or stop any serious search attempt. Someone who would sacrifice the chance to live safely underground in order to protect those who did. She was volunteering. She and Grace would move to a hidden camp near the exit route, close enough to monitor the cave entrance, far enough to avoid immediate detection. They'd serve as sentries, as the community's early warning system. Silas understood what she was offering and what it would cost. Life near the surface, in constant danger of discovery, separated from the relative safety of the sinkhole. No guarantee of escape if she was found, just the cold calculation that one person taking this risk could save 20 others. It was the same calculation he'd made when he decided to return to the plantation, the same mathematics of sacrifice that defined every decision they made. He told her the community would vote on it, that she shouldn't make this choice alone. Elizabeth's expression didn't change. The vote would support her offer because the logic was undeniable. Someone needed to do this, and she was the best suited. Smart enough to stay hidden, brave enough to take the risk, skilled enough to survive in the forest. The vote, held that evening, was as Elizabeth predicted, unanimous support, though several people tried to argue for alternatives, for rotating the duty, for anything that didn't require Elizabeth and Grace to take on the burden alone. But Elizabeth was right. This required consistency, familiarity with the area, the ability to recognize changes in searcher patterns. Rotating the duty would make it less effective. 2 days later, Elizabeth and Grace moved to the surface, carrying supplies for a long-term encampment, carrying the weight of the community's survival. Silas watched them climb up through the vertical chimney, disappearing into the darkness above, and understood that the network they were building required different kinds of escape. Elizabeth was escaping from safety into danger, from the refuge they'd built into the world that wanted to destroy it. Her escape was inward rather than outward, a deliberate choice to put herself between the community and the threat. It was the opposite of what fugitives were supposed to do. But nothing about what they were building followed the rules of what fugitives were supposed to do. 3 days after Elizabeth's departure, Silas began his deep exploration of the cave system. He descended past the sinkhole, past the underground river, past every landmark he'd previously mapped, into passages that existed only as possibilities on Jackson's fragmentary map. The cave system was vast, beyond his earlier imagining. Passages branched and reconnected in patterns that defied simple mapping. Some led to chambers so large his torchlight couldn't reach the walls. Others narrowed to gaps barely wide enough for his body, requiring crawling through spaces that felt less like passages and more like the earth itself trying to close around him. He found evidence of previous explorers, not Jackson's family, but earlier inhabitants, possibly indigenous peoples who'd used the caves centuries before European arrival. Carvings in styles unlike anything in the historical record. Fire pits so old they'd become part of the limestone floor. Artifacts that suggested long-term habitation. On the 8th day, he found the second sinkhole. It was smaller than the first, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, with an opening to the sky that was narrower but somehow admitted more light. The walls were different too, more vertical, more challenging to climb, but also offering more ledges, more natural shelving where structures could be built. And it was empty, untouched, waiting. Silas spent 2 days exploring this second sinkhole, mapping its resources, assessing its capacity. It could support perhaps 15 people with careful management. The soil was deeper, more fertile. The water source was a spring rather than a pool, which meant less risk of the contamination that had driven out Jackson's family. This could work. This could be the backup refuge they desperately needed. But on the 10th day, while exploring passages that connected the 2 sinkholes, Silas found something that changed everything. A chamber approximately 40 miles from the original sinkhole, accessible only through extremely difficult passages, and in that chamber, signs of recent habitation. A fire pit with ashes that weren't ancient, food storage areas with dried goods that weren't decades old, tools that showed recent use, and carved into the limestone wall a message dated 1850. To those who come after, we are not the first, we will not be the last. The mountain protects those who seek protection. Stay hidden, stay safe, stay free. The Collective. Someone else was doing exactly what Silas and his community were doing. Building a life underground, creating a refuge in darkness, existing outside the slave-holding system. And they called themselves a collective, which suggested organization, numbers, infrastructure beyond what Silas had imagined possible. He stood in that chamber, reading the message over and over, understanding that his third escape, the escape back toward slavery to build a rescue network, had revealed something extraordinary. They weren't alone. The network he'd imagined wasn't just possible, it already existed in fragmentary form. Scattered groups, unaware of each other, all pursuing the same vision. What if they could connect these groups? What if the Underground Railroad could become literally underground, a network of cave communities supporting each other, sharing resources, creating a parallel society invisible to the world above? Silas left a message of his own, carved carefully into the limestone. We are 20. We seek alliance. We offer mutual aid and protection. Leave a sign if you wish. Contact. We will return. The Sinkhole Community. Then he continued his exploration, driven now not just by the need to find refuges, but by the possibility of finding allies. Silas returned to the sinkhole after 28 days, exhausted and transformed by what he'd discovered. He carried maps showing 2 additional sinkholes and 3 other chambers that could be developed as way station. He carried information about water sources, passage routes, connection points, and he carried the knowledge that other communities existed, that the vision they were building was larger than any of them had imagined. The community gathered to hear his report. 20 faces, soon to be more, as Elizabeth had sent word that another group of fugitives was approaching the cave entrance,
guided by the new signals she'd established. Silas spread out his crude maps and explained what he'd found. The second sinkhole that could serve as immediate backup refuge. The third that was more distant but more secure. The evidence of other communities, other groups building the same vision. And then he explained what this meant. They were no longer just a hidden community trying to survive. They were part of something larger, something that stretched across the limestone caverns beneath Kentucky, something that was growing in the darkness, while the slaveholders above ground remained blind to it. Isaac, studying the maps with his chronicler's attention to detail, asked the question everyone was thinking. How many people could this network support? If they developed all the sinkholes Silas had found, connected all the scattered communities, how large could this become? Silas had done the mathematics during his return journey. With careful resource management, the 3 sinkholes he'd mapped could support perhaps 75 people. If other communities were similarly sized, and if there were even a dozen such communities scattered through the cave system, they might be sheltering several hundred people. Several hundred people living free in the heart of slave territory. Several hundred people proving every day that the system of slavery was a lie, that black people could govern themselves, could build communities, could thrive without masters. It wasn't the thousands who remained enslaved. It wasn't even a significant fraction of those who suffered under bondage. But it was proof of concept. It was evidence that an alternative existed, and evidence, Silas had learned, was more dangerous to slavery than any violence or rebellion, because evidence could spread, could inspire, could transform the way people thought about what was possible. 2 days after Silas's return, Elizabeth sent a runner, a young woman who'd escaped from a plantation near the Tennessee border, with urgent news. The slave catchers were coming back. Not the small group from before, but a larger force. 12 men, including Coleman, the tracker who'd noticed the symbols. They were equipped for a long-term search, carrying supplies for weeks underground, bringing ropes and climbing equipment and lights. They would search systematically this time, would map every passage, would follow every lead. And Coleman had told the plantation owners he was confident he'd find where the fugitives were hiding. He'd seen marks in caves before, in Tennessee. He knew what to look for. The community had perhaps a week before the search began, maybe less. Silas gathered everyone and laid out their options with brutal clarity. They could evacuate the sinkhole immediately, moving everyone to the second refuge he'd found. It would be chaotic and dangerous, especially moving the children and supplies through the difficult passages, but it was possible. They could stay and prepare to defend the sinkhole if it was discovered, but they had no weapons beyond tools and knives. Against 12 armed men, defense was suicide. Or they could do something unprecedented. They could make contact with the other community Silas had found, could send a message asking for help, for alliance, for the collective strength that might allow them to survive what was coming. The vote was immediate and unanimous. Send the message, seek alliance, stop fighting this battle alone. Silas and Isaac prepared to make the journey to the distant chamber where Silas had left his message. It would take 4 days to reach it, and they had no guarantee the other community had even seen the message, much less responded. But it was the only option that offered hope beyond simple survival. Before they departed, Ruth, who'd become the de facto leader during Silas's explorations,
made an observation that would define everything that came after. She pointed out that what they were attempting was exactly what the slaveholders feared most: organization, coordination, collective action among the enslaved. Every slave rebellion that had ever succeeded, every uprising that had threatened the system, had been built on communication and coordination. They'd been building this network unconsciously, driven by the immediate need to survive and rescue others. But what they'd actually created was infrastructure for something much larger. Not just refuge, but resistance. Not just survival, but an alternative to the entire system. The question was whether they were ready to embrace that fully, to stop thinking of themselves as fugitives hiding in darkness, and start thinking of themselves as builders of a new society that existed in the spaces slavery couldn't reach. The Sinkhole community, 24 people strong now with the recent arrivals, stood in the perpetual twilight and made a choice that would echo through decades. They would build, they would connect, they would grow. And they would prove that freedom could exist, not just at the end of a long flight north, but right here, beneath the feet of those who claimed to own them, in darkness that was deeper and more enduring than any chains.